All right, Dad, how you doing? It
In Moscow, last day in Russia. Yeah, late tonight we're gonna start the journey home
are
back
you
to the
more
good old
worried?
US of A.
Are you more worried when you fly into Russia or when you fly back into the United States? What gives
I'm
you more
actually
anxiety?
it's actually the return trip. I'm afraid of being pulled aside by the authorities at the U.S. airport that we're flying into. Last time, I have to say, the guy didn't give me an ounce of trouble. I mean, it was just, where are you coming from? I said, Russia. And he said, welcome home. And he just waved us through. And I hope that's what will happen again. I haven't heard about anybody having trouble going either way, to be honest. But, you worry at some, except, better known people like Scott Ritter, for example,
Yeah,
so
and then you
obviously
get
had some serious trouble. But you know, I'm flying well below the radar, I
yeah,
think.
you're a nobody. No,
Yeah,
you don't have to worry.
there are advantages to being a nobody.
Yeah, it's always the same for me when I would fly to Shanghai and then back to the US. Flying to China, I never had any worries, any troubles. There's no uncomfortable interactions that I have going into China. But always flying back to the US, I always get a little sense of anxiety and they could be a little bit rude and start asking me these weird questions like, well, what were you doing in China? It's like, I lived there, worked there. Yeah. And I always found the experience coming into America a lot more intimidating.
Yeah,
But
I remember
hopefully,
actually flying back from Palestine a good 12 years ago or so. Yeah, I remember they questioned me a little. It wasn't much, I don't have anything to complain about, but it was enough to make me a bit nervous. Again, what were you doing there? What was your
hmm,
purpose? That kind of thing.
right, they make you feel like you've done something wrong just by
Yeah,
going to this country or going. It's not a pleasant feeling, and I think a lot of people in America they will have a lot of fears flying to a country like Russia or flying to a country like China because of the propaganda that comes out of the United States. They say, "Oh, these are evil authoritarian governments that hate America," which is just it's not true. Right? You fly to China, you fly to Russia. It's easy. It's nice. Actually, I think a lot of these countries actually want Americans in to come over, Westerners to come over to kind of
yeah,
see that hey, we're not
right,
scary. We're just
right,
it's a
right.
normal place. You
Yeah.
can live a
Well, that's
good
what,
life here.
right, right. I think actually like the best solution to Russophobia would be to just give people some sort of package tour to Moscow, or even just have them fly to Moscow, spend one day, and it would be, I assure you that like 95% of Russophobia would be gone from the hearts of the Americans who came here to visit, because it's just
Mm,
such a normal, clean, safe, pretty place. And, and I think in the end, like you were asking, well, what were you imagining? They would be hard pressed, but they would just think it was when they thought about it, there was always a scary music in the background. You get here, there's no
yeah.
scary music. There's just nothing to be scared of.
Yeah, the scary music coupled with the strong Russian accent, and then you're thinking about gulags. You still have this image of the Soviet Union, I think, about
Yeah,
them trailing you and you spoke against the state or something. It's
right.
definitely not true. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and jump into it. So today is August 28th, and we can start with Ukraine. So right before the podcast was started, we were talking a bit. You were talking about this town Pokrovsk, I believe.
Yeah,
Um,
right. Um, you could call it a town, a small city of approximately 60,000. There's another um, city that's almost attached to it. You could consider them one city, kind of twin cities, and that's Mingorod that has a population of 40,000. So the two of them together are 100,000. It's a it's so it's a we're talking about a major population center. Together, they constitute a city larger than Bakhmut, but half the size of Mariupol. So if you want to just put it in context. Now, it's a very important city strategically. Yeah, it just sits at a crossroads, and the main supply routes to Chavas Yar, where a major battle is ongoing, and down to Ugledar, which is another Ukrainian fortress city to the south. Chasiv Yar is to the north, Ugledar is to the south. But they're both supplied through the city, Pokrovsk. So, it's very important. And if the Russians take Pokrovsk, it's not all of the Donbass, but I think quickly a good part of the Donbass will fall, and the rest of it will fall not too long afterwards. And the interesting thing about this is that I think we're witnessing a true collapse. We've talked about maybe a slowly uh, accel acceleration in the Russian advance over the last several months. They've been advancing faster and faster. It's still, up until very recently, it was still rather slow. It was maybe half a kilometer a day, but it was steady and it was in many parts of the line. Whereas before we saw no movement or only saw some movement in one part of the line. Um, but now it's fast. We see it's can be 2, 3, 4, 5 kilometers in a day. And just to give you an example, there was I think it's Novgorodka, a town just to the east. I guess more or less the southeast of Pokrovsk. Nothing too big. We're talking about 16, 17,000, but the Russians took it in basically 3 days. And that's really just unprecedented in this war. Typically, a 3 day. Well, to give you an example, the town of New York, which is south of Toretsk, it took the Russians actually 2 months to take it, and that was considered fast. They took this in 3 days, so that gives you an idea of what's going on. It looks like there really is a collapse, and recently there was a Ukrainian Rada, that's the Ukrainian parliament member, go there and it visited the area just a few days ago. She saw that there were fortifications, fairly substantial fortifications to the east of these towns, but they weren't built up. These are not fortress cities the way that Toretsk is, or New York for that matter, or certainly Avdiivka or Bakhmut. These were fortress cities. They were, not only did they have fortifications in front of them, but there were virtually every structure within the city had been converted into a fortification. And that's why, I mean, these battles can be so grueling, why they can take so long, and why they end up with the total destruction of the town or the city. But we've passed through that main line of fortification. So that's one reason I believe that we're seeing much more rapid movement. The Russians have broken through and they're on the other side. There are still fortifications in these areas, but they're not nearly as extensive. But then another thing is, the Russians are reporting this, and the Ukrainians too. The Ukrainians are not fighting the way they used to. They're not. They used to be very tenacious. They would stay in these fortifications and fight until they were all dead, or it was just the fortification was pulverized, or just a few of them were left, and the Russians would storm the trench or the bunker or whatever it was. It's after a day of shelling, and the guys turn and run. And I think we're seeing basically what we predicted. We've seen all these videos of people who clearly have no desire to go to the front, but they're being pulled off the streets, nabbed and dragged into these vans. And these are people who do not want to fight. And I think that's what's happening. I mean, they put bodies in these trenches and in these bunkers, but they're just bodies. They're not dedicated soldiers, and they have no interest in losing their lives to hang on to this piece of ground. So when it starts to get a little scary, they turn and run. That's part of it. And then they're saying that the Russians have got them greatly outnumbered. I mean, it's just a lot of these units have been worn down. A lot of the you know, a lot of the fighters and probably the most dedicated ones have been killed. And then some were pulled off for this adventure in the north in Kursk. So there's just not many people. They're not dedicated. The fortifications aren't as strong as they used to be. And the Russians are just plowing through. So at least on this part of the front, I think we really are seeing what we could call a collapse. I've been hearing talk of a collapse or something for like almost 2.5 years, like it's imminent, but I think we're actually seeing it, at least in this part of the line right now. Now, some people have a theory, actually, on the pro-Russian side, that maybe this is intentional, that the Ukrainians are actually finally playing it smart, and instead of trying to hang on to every, square centimeter of ground the way they have been, and always fighting to the last man, they decided actually to pull back and into a more well-defended place and just to make a stand there. I haven't seen any evidence of that. In fact, so they're saying maybe like they are going to just try to fight like hell for Pokrovsk. But again, the same RADA member that I mentioned earlier, she said that in fact soldiers were retreating from Pokrovsk already. And it's hard for me to believe that all of a sudden the Ukrainians are fighting smart. And they're no longer concerned with the PR game, with the narrative. While they're doing this, they're continuing with this crazy adventure up north that is obviously costing them down there. So I don't believe that there was all of a sudden a change to a more sensible policy. I don't see any evidence of that. I think they just say they've been attrited. You know, they've lost their main fortifications, and the people that are left are just not the dedicated fighters that they once had.
So do you believe that we're rapidly moving towards the end of this war? If there's a complete
Well,
collapse, do we just
I wouldn't quite say that. I mean, there's Ukraine's a big country, right? I think sometimes people forget that it's a very large country, and I think what you could say is we're looking at the end. We may be looking at the end of the war for the Donbass. Again, when Pokrovsk falls, and it could be pretty rapid, it could be in a couple weeks, then I think there's a good chance that we'll see a continuation of this relatively rapid advance all the way to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, and that'll be it for the Donbass. And then up north we've got Seversk. They're closing on Seversk um, from from at least two, maybe three directions now. But again, Ukraine's a big country, and we'll see. It could be it could be that it'll just continue to unravel from here. Maybe maybe their last hurrah was this adventure up in Kursk. They did put everybody says those were their best units. One of the reasons again that we're seeing this collapse in Pokrovsk is that there was the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which was one of their most elite, if not their most elite brigade, was actually pulled off the line just to the east of Pokrovsk. They were part of the main defensive line holding the Russians back. And so that's one of the main reasons they're gone. They've been sent up north, but now they're just getting hammered up north in Kursk. And yeah, they just don't have the reserves that they had. I mean, that's the thing where yeah, we may really be looking at the end if there isn't some new trick that NATO has up its sleeve. It looks like the Ukrainians have run out of reserves. They have them, their reserves are again at Kursk, because that's why they're holding the line at Kursk. Is okay, they don't have the fortifications, but they can keep on putting in fresh meat, right? But eventually, they're gonna run out of fresh meat. I mean, those reserve units are going to be just torn apart. And down here, down in the Donbass, they just don't have them. So, there are holes in the line, the holes that they used to be able to plug. They'd always bring in new people and continue the fight. They can't do it. So unless there's something, both problems seem insoluble to me, both the equipment and the men, right? I mean, you're
right?
talking about bringing in women, but you know, that's not a solution. That's
Yeah,
a sign that you're losing. That you just let's be honest. Um,
right. Well, I mean, yeah, uh, the West seems like they don't want this war to end. They want to kind of have some stalemate at least
uh,
until the election. Do you think that's a
right.
big part of this, that we need to keep this
Well, for
going
the
till November for the
yeah, well, for
Americans,
the
which is
U.S.
NATO?
definitely. Yeah, for the U.S. definitely.
How much
Um,
power do they have to make sure that it lasts till November?
yeah,
I
well,
mean, it's still a ways
but
to
their power,
go.
yeah, their power is limited. Right now you can see the limits to their power, right? I mean, because they can't create new Ukrainians. You could try to force the men that have fled to Western Europe back, but that has all sorts of problems, PR problems, legal problems. I don't think that's going to happen. And yeah, there are limits we've found to the equipment that they send. They've depleted their stockpiles, and their production capacity is limited. So they're sending Ukraine what they can, like every month. Somebody who's very good on these kind of things and been very good and accurate all along is Brian Berletic, that he keeps track of military production. And what he points out that yeah, in past packages that, like in the first year or a year and a half of the war, the U.S. would announce a package, and it would be fairly substantial, and they'd list the numbers. And now, and it would be, it would vary. There would be new things added to new packages. Now it's the same thing. They don't list the numbers, and I think there's a reason for that because the numbers are so low that it just is bad PR. And he says it looks like it gives every appearance of being just they're just drawing from monthly production. They don't have stockpiles anymore, and their monthly production is just very, very limited. We know, I was just reading today that they'd up the shell production, artillery shell production, from 24,000 to 36,000. But
Monthly.
that's yeah, but that's like 6 days of for Ukraine, 6 days in a month. So they only supply them with 6 days worth of artillery shells. But that's also saying, assuming that you give them all to Ukraine. But of course, Israel wants them, and the U.S. has to hang on to some of them too. So they're going to get even less than that. That's just one example. They're giving them a certain fraction of monthly production, but that is a very limited amount, and it clearly isn't enough. So what else can they do? I mean, they're actually, and then recently, Poland just announced, I think today, that okay, yeah, sorry, we don't have anything more to give you. We gave you billions and billions of dollars worth of equipment. Germany is cutting back. They just say, look, we've got our budget. We're well over budget. I'm sorry, we got to, we're not going to bust our own budget for you. And that's what you're hearing. Britain it was pathetic to begin with, and now they have nothing to give them. And
It's
yeah, the U.S. gave them ATACMS, but the U.S. stopped producing ATACMS years ago. And now I think, and the ATACMS were almost entirely neutralized, and I think Ukraine just has a few left. That's what everyone assumes, and then there's really nothing to replace them with. So yeah,
yeah,
it's looking pretty grim. Maybe there's something that we don't know about, some trick, up the NATO sleeve, but I don't see it. So in May, I certainly see the end of. Well, one thing is we don't know what the Russian government is going to decide to do. Like once they take the Donbass, I think they made it clear it's also going to be Zaporozhye and Kherson, right? They've already said that these are ours. So yeah, I think we'll see a push after they take the Donbass to take Zaporozhye and Kherson, and it'll be, um, the Kherson will be a challenge because they do have to cross the river, and I guess at least part of Zaporozhye too. They have to cross the Dnieper to do that, and but they probably reached there's now such a mismatch in forces that that's something that they feel confident about doing.
it just always amazes me when you talk about the shell production and the ability to supply weapons to Ukraine. When we've talked about NATO constitutes 75% of global military spending is NATO
Right?
spending. NATO constitutes 3/4 of all the spending on military around the world. Yet we can't even produce artillery
Yeah.
shells.
Right.
It's I always come back to like we have so many people in our military. Couldn't you tell those guys like, hey, all right, we have a lot of people. We have 800 bases around the world. We got trillions of dollars that we're pouring into this military industrial complex. Shouldn't we devote some of it, just a tiny sliver, to, let's say, producing these plants and training of, our military engineering
Yeah.
corps to produce these things? Like,
Yeah.
how can we not direct it? Like, what are these guys doing with all of our money? What are
Yeah.
they doing?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's the system. I mean, we have military production is all contracted out. That's private enterprise. They have contracts with the government. So another country like Russia or China can do something like that. They have I guess these military companies and factories were always under state ownership. And let's be honest, in these kind of situations, that seems to give gives the Russian and the Chinese an advantage. They could set aside the space that was just idling there and producing no profits for anybody. But when it became necessary in the event of a war, right, you just you start up the production lines, and you can devote the resources, you allocate the resources, and get it done. And I don't know. Well, I guess they do have to hire the workers. They don't use soldiers, as far as I know, but it seems to be working. Let's be honest. I mean, yeah, it is crazy. I think that the whole, it shows there's, first of all, something wrong with the metrics, right? We get these things, we have a GDP that's 10 times the size of, Italy has a GDP larger than in Russia. Yeah, I think you'd have to stop and say, well, if that's the case, then maybe there's a problem with the metrics, so the way that we measure economic
Right.
wealth and economic production. Recently there was something that came out that showed that Russia had moved up and was something like eighth in the world in manufacturing, but it was still like behind Mexico. And the U.S. and Germany together, producing according to this metric, produces something like 15 times as much as Russia. And I remember seeing those at the beginning when the war first kicked off, and I was thinking, well, Russia better act quickly, or they're going to be absolutely flattened, by the Western steamroll, because there's just so much bigger. They can make so much more. They have so much more manufacturing power, but they don't. So it shows you there's something wrong with the way we measure this. I don't know. I think in some ways analogous to like education, because I always hear it's like, politicians bragging that we spent so much in education. I increased the education budget by another 20% or whatever. It's just sort of like you begin to mistake the dollar figure with the reality. You say the more that you spend on something, then the more of the thing there is. But
Mm.
that's not true. It's just like you can keep on spending more in education and the kids don't know anymore, right? Because when it really comes down to dedicated teachers and dedicated students, and if you don't have them, it doesn't matter how much you spend in education. And I
Right.
think it's something similar when we get in the military. We have some sort of system that that sucks in a lot of dollars. It's really good at that, and those dollar figures keep on going up, and politicians keep on bragging that they're supporting their military. But the reality is that the things that are needed are not getting produced.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's almost kind of, if you just think about it, it's kind of Econ 101 is that because you said that the manufacturing of this military equipment is contracted out to private enterprises, but there's only a handful. So you have an oligopoly or really kind of a
Yeah,
monopoly just on
right.
certain production. Like only one private company produces artillery shells or let's say,
Uh-huh.
attack
Yeah,
missiles or Patriot missiles, whatever. So they can just bill them whatever they want because they're the only
right.
company, and they know that the government, what it does is it just prints money. So you have this problem with, you have a connection with the military industrial complex is plugged into the printing press, so they can say,
Hmm.
okay, they're budgeting $1 trillion. Well, let's charge $5 million a Patriot missile, and we'll
Yeah.
produce
Oh,
500, and
yeah,
it's
right. Yeah, yeah,
like
no,
it
that's
shouldn't cost that much,
it
but
should
we're just
right,
throwing money away, and
right.
and so that's why we can say we're spending 75% of the global military
Yeah,
spending is from NATO, which is primarily the United States, but you
yeah,
don't get the results. You just throw money into this pot, and it's just a
right,
few,
right.
private corporations that just get to charge whatever they want.
Yeah, yeah,
Such an obvious, horrible system
right,
that should be fixed.
right. Well, there's corruption everywhere. Clearly there's been a lot of corruption in Russia. 'Cause recently many generals and other high-ranking officials have been arrested ever since the new defense minister took over. So yeah, so people say, oh, shake their heads and say, oh, Russia really has a corruption problem. Yeah, it does, and glad. Fortunately, was it Usanov, the new defense minister, is working on it, and it's good news that he's arresting these guys. But don't stop and think. See that America doesn't have the same problem. The thing is, our problem is institutionalized. That's something that we've talked about before. Obviously, these things are being a lot of things. There's this overcharging. I mean, every once in a while you hear these stories. I remember hearing them like 30, 40 years ago. It was like $500 for a toilet seat, or just recently, it's like $2,000 for basically a wastebasket. These kind of things, they come out, but it's ongoing, it's constant. The thing is, nobody gets arrested, nobody gets in trouble because it's actually done according to the rules. It's just the rules are fixed in favor of these few companies that you're talking about. And
Right.
so, it's basically legalized, institutionalized corruption. and it's huge. We really are talking about billions and trillions of dollars. Nobody gets arrested, and we can all pretend that we're law-abiding people, but
Mm.
it's corruption.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it's the same thing in China that, they are very public about trying to crack down on corruption. That was one of Xi Jinping's, platform pieces that he ran on. And, you hear about it, it's in China, they would arrest certain, provincial leaders or whatever that were exposed for corruption. And you're thinking like, oh yeah, China, it's corrupt. But they're actually aware of it. Same thing as in Russia. And they're actually trying to tackle it. Whereas in the United States, it's like, yeah, there's no corruption. Everybody does things by the books. That's why we charge $200,000 for a bag of screws. Like, that's corruption. That's what it is.
Yeah,
It's institutionalized corruption,
yeah,
but we don't see
right.
it.
Yeah, because that
Yeah,
that money ends up in some pockets,
right,
and
right, right. Sure. It's not
and
like they're taking bribes directly from people, but
right,
actually, it's almost I would prefer that because you could
yeah,
see it. It's at least it's
right.
transparent. Like this is what it is. This is corruption.
Okay.
Because the
Yeah,
problem we have in the United States is we have to overhaul the whole system, and then
yeah,
that gets bogged down and becomes very, very difficult to change something that has become institutionalized.
right. Yeah,
Actually, I was
so many people are benefiting from it. So many people have an interest in it that a lot of people don't want to see change.
right. Yeah, I was just having a thought last night. I was thinking, like, how do we fix this problem? We spend like almost $1 trillion on our military every year. And if we want to change our foreign policy and pull back these bases, well, how do you do that? You got all these people that are in the military, all this money going in the military. What can you do? And for me, the solution would be like, well, yeah, we got all this money, we got all this manpower. Let's turn it into something like the Civilian Conservation Corps, that FDR had, the
Uh-huh.
CCC, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
FDR had a whole alphabet soup of social programs,
Uh-huh.
and most of them are causing problems for us today because we can't afford them. And then there's that
Uh-huh.
famous quote: "There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government
You're
program."
right,
Well,
right, right,
unfortunately, one of the few temporary programs that were actually temporary was the CCC, which is
right.
maybe the only one that I wish we
Yeah,
kept. All the
yeah, right.
others,
Yeah,
like
yeah, no, right. A lot of my favorite state parks were built by the CCC. They did wonderful work. It's the thing you say, whatever you, whatever opinion you have about this, you just can't deny that they actually created useful and aesthetically pleasing, permanent structures just all around the country. They did very good work.
yeah, and it's
Yeah,
almost
well,
been 100 years, and we're still benefiting from it, and we will for hundreds of
yeah,
years on.
right.
And so it's like if someone like RFK comes in, like he's always about the environment. It's like, and Trump, maybe if they can get that policy idea, Trump, RFK, if you're listening, do this. You turn the military into the new CC, at least short term, fix our
Yeah,
infrastructure. You got all this manpower instead of spending it all, giving billions and billions to Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin that produce things that clearly don't even work anymore. Build high speed rail, fix our roads, fix our, everything. Like we could just turn it just frustrates me because we talk about just the amount of waste on these wars. Literally trillions of dollars on these foreign wars that have brought us nothing but, death and destruction abroad and debt at home that is sinking the economy and burdening every single American here in the United States. Not only that, but think about the opportunity cost. If we
yeah,
didn't spend all those trillions abroad and all those people going abroad to kill other people or get killed themselves, if they were here spending that money building things here, think about what we could have done.
mhm,
Let's just start with the end of the Soviet Union, in 91. In the
right.
past, 30 years or so, what we could have done with all those trillions of dollars. America would just be such an
Yeah,
amazing place. I go to China, and I can take a high speed rail from Shanghai to Beijing in 4 hours, thousands of miles, just
right.
like, pew. And and like, we don't have that. We don't have anything. Everything's
Yeah.
breaking down here. It's frustrating. So
Yeah.
this is what one of the things that I would do if I was president. I never will be.
Uh-huh.
And it's just a pipe dream. But there
Yeah.
are solutions to these things
Uh-huh.
if we just have the right people in power
Yeah.
to
Right.
do it,
Yeah. It's
But
amazing that America is as wealthy as it is. It's still a very wealthy country. And overall life is pretty good in America. I think in general people are worried about their future. It's not just you. Or, surveys show that most Americans expect I think America's moving in the wrong direction. But still, it's amazing that we're doing as well as we are. But we would be doing so much better if we had allocated our resources more wisely. If we hadn't, think if, like you're just saying, if we hadn't wasted these trillions of dollars. Just the Iraq war by itself was, depending on how you measure it, cost us $2 or $3 trillion. Because it was worse than nothing. It just made the world worse, for both for us and most definitely for the Iraqis. Yeah, $2, $3 trillion for this. If we just hadn't done that, just think about what, and we had, yeah, invested in infrastructure or just put it in people's pockets and let them invest it the way they want, however whatever course you took the world, we would be in such a much stronger place now than we are. There's
Yeah.
nothing we can do about it. It
But
happened.
yeah, I think part of the big problem, I guess, it's the neo. Actually, this is something else I wanted to talk about. Like I feel like a big problem is this neocon ideology. When did this neocon foreign policy to dominate? Where did it come from? Can you first define what a
Oh, okay.
neocon is, and
Right.
where did it
Um,
originate from? Because we
yeah.
use this term all the time,
Yeah. Sometimes
and I
it's
think it's
used,
good
I
to kind
think,
of talk about it.
right. I think sometimes it often is used too broadly as just to mean a warmonger. You can say a
Mm,
neocon is a warmonger, but a neocon is a particular kind of warmonger. The neocons, is short for neoconservative, have their roots with ex-Trotskyites. Now, my understanding is the Trotskyites were ones that wanted to, who believed in the old Soviet Union, believed that you had to bring revolution to the world. That the world had to have a revolution, become communist before you could really achieve, the workers' paradise here on Earth. So they wanted to export the revolution. You couldn't just stop and rest on your laurels in the Soviet Union. Stalin, was not a Trotskyist. Trotsky was his enemy, and Trotsky fled. He was eventually assassinated in Mexico. He was
mm,
found dead with an ice pick lodged in his
right.
brain. But there continued to be Trotskyites. People had this ideology, leftists who believed in exporting revolution. Some of them underwent a conversion to, I think, certainly after the death of Stalin and after it became clear that the Soviet Union was declining. And then I think because they were largely Jewish, they began to identify more and more with American power rather than Soviet power because the government began to have somewhat of an uneasy relationship, let's say, with Jews. They didn't openly persecute them, but there was some friction and tension between the government and the Soviet Union's Jewish population. That was, one of the first things that they sought was emigration for Jews from the Soviet Union. So that they switched allegiances, and so their
Wait,
old
wait.
allegiance that we're talking
Sorry.
about the Trotskyites, right?
Right, right. But you're saying the Trotskyites, they were Jewish people? I mean,
Yeah,
you're
largely,
saying that.
almost entirely, right? Well,
Really?
that
Okay.
was not unusual, just in general. Like in the 1930s, 1940s, America, communists, people on the far left tended to be Jewish. Not all of them, by a long shot. Not all. You can't say they were one and the same, but a lot of them were. And these Trotskyites were largely Jewish. So they had an allegiance to the Soviet Union, but they switched it to the United States, starting in, let's say, the late 60s. And so that, but when they actually, you found them in both. I think they first found him actually in the Democratic Party around Scoop Jackson. Jackson, he was a senator from the state of Washington, and he was a very strong hawk and very anti-Soviet. But they eventually migrated to the Republican Party when Reagan became president. So what they were about, I mean, it was not just that they were hawks, but they were in favor of exporting American ideology. So that's what sets them apart from, let's say, other people who are hawks. There may be sets them apart very much from an America firster who just says, okay, well, America should just pursue its own interests, and but we don't have any obligation to export our ideology. It's just that America will defend her borders. America will, stand by her allies, and that's that. Um, but the Trotskyites or I should say now the neocons, believe that we have to do more. We need to export the revolution, so to speak. That is, we have to export the American way of life. So it means political liberalism, democracy, markets, free markets, that kind of thing. And you saw it on this full display actually with the invasion of Iraq under George W. Bush. He had a lot of neocons in his administration. So wasn't just that, okay, that we need to overthrow this guy, or, defeat him, but that we need to impose the American way of life on this country. We need to teach him to, introduce him to all those institutions, those glorious things, democracy, free markets, and so on and so forth. Um,
And how did that work out for
and
us?
it was a total failure, right? It was a total disaster. Um, but they're still around, and they still, so when you find people who are, I think you see it now, both, certainly the Russophobes in the administration, in the U.S. government are typically neocons. They also, they tend to be loyal to Israel, and they tend to hate Russia. So, when they talk about Russia, it's not just that, okay, you know, Russia has its interests, we have our interests, and we need to compromise, or we need to work out some sort of modus vivendi, or it's no, we have to, Russia needs to be, in a sense, converted. Right? Russia, we have to bring the American way of life to Russia. Russia is not just a rival, but Russia is evil. Russia is, doesn't have, or is, you know, doesn't have the institutions, or, it hasn't adopted the ideology, the American ideology fully, and it needs to. So, I think this is part of the reason why we find ourselves in such a fix. They just can't, they can't let bygones be bygones. They can't let Russians be Russians, and Iranians be Iranians, and Chinese be Chinese. So, constantly have to pressure these countries, because not just, again, because they're our rivals, but because they're wrong, because they have the wrong kinds of institutions, they have the wrong kinds of ideas, and they must be corrected. They must, we must export our ideology to them, and they need to accept it, and then we can't really rest until the whole world has adopted the American way, the Western way, the
Mm.
liberal way, and now
I could
increasingly as we develop the woke way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I could see, maybe 50 years ago how that idea concept could have had some traction and move forward, because America really was this, just this colossus that was with a booming economy, and we were exporting our culture, or the movies, the music. We got McDonald's and Coca-Cola and blue jeans and Star Wars. It's like everyone's like, wow, America is so cool. But it just seems so deranged to try it now, when people are looking at, you gotta, we gotta export our way of life, and people look at Americans like, you guys can't even define what a woman is anymore. Your president has dementia,
Right.
and you lied to everybody out for a long time, and now he's just AFK. He's not even around anymore. He's just, and you've installed Kamala, who hasn't done an interview yet in over a month and 40 days, and
Right.
everyone's like, what is this way of life, this system you have? There's a huge amount of unrest.
So, right.
Everybody's at each other's throats here. It's like the idea of trying to export the American way of life at this point in time just seems delusional. I think it's been delusional for the past
Yeah.
20 years. I could see
Right.
how I never think it's a good, you shouldn't try to impose how another country or another people should live. I think it was just a wrong way of thinking back then, but I could see
Yeah.
how it had the ability to make real headways back in the day. Today,
Uh-huh.
it's just the more we try, the more stupid we look. And but
Right. Yeah,
that's
I
where
think
we're
it's
going.
true. I mean, it's just, well, there used to be a stark contrast. Let's say when the neocons first emerged back in the 1970s, or the late 1960s, early 90s, right? These were very different systems. And now, and it was, I think, a contrast that really did favor us. Most of the world, when they came to see both systems, ended up favoring ours, and looked to the American system. Now, yeah, again, their problem was their aggressive, militarily aggressive approach to this. I think, if you got the system that works, you can be confident that you're going to win in the end. You don't need to bring the world to the edge of a nuclear war or anything like that to do it. You don't need to. It wasn't military pressure that brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the end, it was like it's certainly true in China too. It's just the Chinese looked at the mainland Chinese looked at Taiwan and they saw how economically successful they were, and they just made the decision, okay, yeah, we need to at least import certain aspects of the system. And clearly, there's certain aspects that clearly are working very well, and we need to incorporate it within our own system. And they did it, starting with Deng Xiaoping. So it was there was this contrast, but there was no need for us to be aggressive. And now the contrast is not what it used to be. If anything, now much of the world is looks at Russia and China and Iran and so on. They actually, if they go, especially if they go and visit these countries, they say, life's not bad in these places. And the people there actually, by and large, support their governments more so than Americans support their government. And yeah, so you don't really have that kind of that easy sell that you used to have, but you continue to have the aggression. In fact, the U.S. has become hyper aggressive. Even when they have as their own country declines, when they have less and less to offer, they at the very same time they become more aggressive.
Yeah, it's just we're seeing it's just the end of the empire. We keep on talking about it. It's just this is what we're witnessing, and we're lashing out because we don't want to believe that our system is broken, that we're no longer number one, that not everybody loves America. Hardly anybody loves America anymore. Americans don't even love America anymore, and still we're trying to export our system and keep these wars going, and it's sad. Um, when did the neocon ideology really become the dominant foreign policy for the United States? When did that really? Because that's really one of the
Yeah.
biggest problems of the United States. I think is that neocon
Yeah.
ideology. It dictates our foreign policy.
Yeah. Well, I would have to say it was with George W. Bush in the Iraq War. And you heard he had a lot of neocons in his administration. His father actually knew about the neocons, but he considered them crazies. And he kind of tried to keep them in the basement. I think he actually warned his son about them. um,
God damn it, Bush.
but it was under George W. Bush that's when we started to hear, if you're not with us, you're against us. And you got that open talk about bringing democracy to the Middle East. This is how they were going to solve the problem of, conflict in the Middle East. They weren't going to try to actually, push for the two-state solution, but they were going to export democracy first to Iraq and then to Syria and then, everything, and teach them, the benefits of the American system, and they were just sure they thought they would essentially just sort of ignite revolution throughout the Middle East, and then once all these countries became little Americas, then we would have peace because we would all be on the same side. You heard it was, I think it was, who was the Secretary of State at the time? Her name escapes me at the moment. The black lady from Stanford. But
Oh,
anyway, yeah,
Condoleezza Rice.
Condoleezza Rice. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think she said that it was, yeah, you had to bring democracies to countries because democracies never start wars. She said that shortly before we launched the war against Iraq, of course. So it was it was total nonsense. But that's the way they thought, right? So it's just that this is, we can't avoid exporting our ideology because that's really the solution. They have to become good Americans as long as they have these alien ideologies. They believe in Islam. They feel that they belong to a different civilization. They're Confucians in China or whatever. We're always going to have this clash. We got to end the clash by exporting our way to every. Yeah, so
Okay,
it
well,
definitely. Yeah, I think it really came into its own under George W. Bush.
but the strange thing is that it was under a Republican president, George W. Bush, but it just continued. It seemed like after that, it just
Oh
like
yeah,
once
well
they
they
got
go.
in, they
Yeah,
stayed
they go.
in, right?
Yeah, that's right, and they go back and forth between the parties. I think now they're mostly with the Democrats, um, because again they're not comfortable with Trump because Trump's really not a neocon. See, that's the way he talks about just getting along with these different people. Like, I can talk to Putin, I can talk to Xi or whatever. And you're not supposed to talk that way. They're evil. They need to be, you have to work for regime change because they represent a different kind of civil. I think Trump really doesn't think that way. I mean, maybe again, the kind of the one glaring exception. It's not so much a neocon thing, but he has sold his soul to the Zionists. But aside from that, he believes in actually getting along with different leaders, regardless of what their systems are. So, he does talk about just, making peace with the Russians, and the neocons don't like that kind of language. They know that he's not one of theirs.
We need to change the term neocon because I think it's just because it's neoconservative. People just associate it with the Republican Party. And this is a
Yeah,
big problem that somehow people that don't follow the news closely or what's
yeah,
happening globally, they just assume that maybe the Democrat Party is still the peace party when they
yeah,
are the neocon party now.
yeah.
It's,
Yeah,
I mean,
the
I know that
Republicans are
sounds
definitely not
crazy, but
yeah, right. The Republicans are definitely not the peace party, but
yeah,
neither
well,
are the
we don't have
Democrats,
any peace party,
not
but
by a
we
long
have
shot,
at least
right?
one party that
Yeah,
might
no,
end
you're
one
right.
war,
Yeah, no, it's a much misused term, and even by people who are much more knowledgeable, they tend to use it just to describe any kind of hawk in the U.S. I'll give you one example: is John Bolton is described as a neocon, but he's not really a neocon. He's just a warmonger. I mean, he's not
Mm.
interested in exporting any ideology. He just wants to, bomb and overthrow governments, and just make a show of American power.
Mm.
That.
Yeah. Okay, Dad. Well, let me ask you just one more question if you have time.
Sure.
I just want to pivot completely over to the Middle East. I've been hearing just stuff about there being a bit more unrest within Israel itself, the possibility of just more friction between the IDF. There is an editorial in Haaretz which was very condemnatory of Netanyahu's policies and saying that basically he's destroying Israel. And then some prominent retired military official
Right.
or like the equivalent of the FBI in Israel made the statement that Israel won't exist in a year thanks to what Netanyahu's doing. So
Right.
it's clear that there is some real worry within Israel now
Yeah.
about what's happening and if they can maintain this much longer. And we've talked about this before that Israel is just committing suicide on the global stage through its
Yeah.
actions. Like there's really it's digging a hole the further it goes. There's no way out. It seems like that reality is starting to seep in to the Israeli population to some extent, which could
Yeah.
cause a serious problem. Potentially even like a mini civil war in Israel. Can you
Right.
talk about what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, it's it's not really an argument over Zionism. These are all Zionists, and they're all committed to the Zionist project. And I think, in the end, they're all committed to expansion of Israel territory, and none of them is actually interested in recognizing a Palestinian state, or even really recognizing the rights of Palestine. They're either in favor of some kind of apartheid or in favor of ethnic cleansing or some combination of the two. But there is, okay, I think, like I've said, there is a real difference in tone, which is a serious, it's more than a difference in tone. There are people like this retired general who are very disturbed by the rise of these radical groups, these militias. I think it's Smotrich in particular. He has militias even prior to becoming the Ministry of, I think it was Security, um, and his own militias. And now, now they're irregulars. They're not part of the IDF. But you see them rampaging in the West Bank. You see them, pounding on the doors of this prison. You see this kind of behavior. They're acting outside of the law, and without any consequences. They know that they're protected, at the highest level by Smotrich, Netanyahu, and the rest of them. And this general has a fear that, that really the rule of law is coming to an end in Israel. And I think that fear is legitimate. That there always was this kind of this radical element. This was kind of again, I would say that Israel made a bargain with the devil, after the 1967 war when they let the it was just a few years after, it may have been even like a year after, that the first settlement was established in the West Bank. And that was the first time you say, okay, this was clearly a violation of international law. And it was the beginning of a settler movement that has always been in tension with let's say Israeli authority, duly constituted Israeli authority. Um, and there have always been these radicals. There's been the movement that we talked about to establish the third temple, and to tear down the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to blow it up. And actually, I believe that what Ben Gvir has been associated with that. He was actually was and is very closely tied to that movement. Um, but these have been always outside of the law. The agency is to treat them with kid gloves. That's why I say there's really been a, a bargain with the devil. It was just that the Israelis let this grow. They've let the settler movement grow. They've let the settlements grow within the West Bank, and these militias have become more powerful. Now they're right there at the core of Israeli power, right? Now we have Smotrich and Ben Gvir. These are the people that were way out on the fringes just a few decades ago, and they're now right at the center of power. These were the crazies. The people that were really outside the law, and now they're equal to the law. They have the same kind of authority that the IDF has, and that's scary for the IDF and for these people. And so, yeah, it presents a real threat to the system. Now, internally it's a threat. It's a threat to the Israeli system of law. It creates a potential for some kind of civil war. The IDF has been obedient to the civilian authority, but like this recent incident we saw, this really horrifying incident of the poor Palestinian that was forcibly sodomized by the Israeli soldiers, and then you know and then we saw the intervention of this mob. That really shined a light on what's happening here, and I think we may see more of it. Who knows how it's going to play out, but there clearly are some very powerful forces, conflicting forces at play within Israel, and this has obvious consequences too for Israel's international image. I mean, when you have the people like the old, let's say, secular Ashkenazi Jews used to be the face of Israel to the world. Now, again, I don't really think they were much better than Smotrich and these people. They were responsible for Nakba, and they were responsible for just chipping away and for letting the settlers do this. They made the bargain with the devil, and and it's really their own fault that they helped to create the situation that they find themselves in right now. But they did present a much, let's say, more cosmopolitan and reasonable face to the world, and especially to the U.S. They knew how to communicate with American Jews and Americans of all faiths and persuasions, right? Um, and certainly to Western Europe and the rest of the world. But if these people start to get replaced by, the Smotriches and the Ben Gvirs, it's Israel's stock, which has already dropped sharply, is going to drop much more. I mean, Israel's already a pariah to much of the world, and it's going to, but it's going to get even worse if they continue down the track that they're on.
And they seem to be continuing down that track. There doesn't
Yeah,
seem to be any turnaround, right? It just
yeah. I mean,
this is
there
the end.
obviously, yeah, there are
This is
people
the end of
protesting.
Israel.
There are, yeah, but yeah, that seems to be the trend.
Did
That's
you see any way where Israel survives?
Well, it could. I mean, again, Israel itself, it does have a powerful military. We've seen its limits in Gaza, but it does have a powerful air force. And I think it demonstrated that the other day, when they sent the 100 aircraft against South
But
Lebanon.
did it really? I mean, because all right, you sent 100 aircraft, a big thing, but it didn't seem to really do too much in terms of to Hezbollah, right? They're still there. They just
Yeah,
said
they're
this was
still there,
phase
right?
one. They're still going.
Yeah,
Like you
yeah,
didn't
but they
really
can,
deter
yeah.
Hezbollah, did you?
Well, I heard that they just did an awful lot of damage to the civilian infrastructure as well.
Yeah, they're good at blowing up
Um,
civilian buildings,
yeah,
but I mean,
right. Yeah, but that is something. I mean, it's it makes you think. That's one reason that Iran thinks twice. They don't want to get into a war because they know that they can. A lot of civilians are going to die. And I think Hezbollah thinks about that too. You know, they're very much a part of their communities there. And you say, well, it's it's their parents and sisters and brothers and cousins and that are going to be killed, when the Israelis come with their aircraft and start bombing their villages. So it is something. It is power, and they don't just hit civilian targets. They do hit military sometimes. Again, I believe Hezbollah does have, like Hamas, an extensive underground network. So I don't think they can defeat them, but they can do an awful lot of damage to people. So anyway, that's just one thing. There's limits to it. The limits are obvious, and we've discussed them. But they also have the sponsor of the U.S. And the U.S. is still with them, and it's going to be with them for at least another 4 years. It doesn't matter who's going to win the election. The U.S. is going to be on their side. But looking at like beyond that, it just looks very bad. It's just already, you still have, again, a lot of Western European governments, but I think those are going to start to fall away just because there's, again, the people are so horrified by what's happening there that, again, especially if somebody like a Ben-Gvir takes power, it's going to be very difficult to maintain the fiction, that Israel is anything other than a genocidal power. And so it'll just add to its isolation. Yeah, I can see them hanging on for a while, months, maybe years. But after a certain point, I don't think they can. I just seems like they've gone, unless there's some sort of miraculous U-turn in Israeli society, and I see no signs of that. They are on a path to destruction, self-destruction, and the destruction of some neighboring countries too, unfortunately.
okay, well, we'll end it on that somber note. Okay. All right. Well, Dad, have a good flight back to America. And for our next podcast, I'm not sure if I will be heading up to Kentucky for a wedding. So we'll see if we'll be able to do one. We'll try to squeeze one in. But if not, apologies to anybody listening. And if
Okay,
anybody's made it this far, please like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. Okay. All right. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Dad. Bye bye.
bye.